Well, everybody was small farms back then. I mean, if you milked 25 or 50 head of cattle, you were a fairly large farm. If you farmed 50 acres, you were a fairly large farm back then, you know? I mean, you only had tractors that just barely bigger than your lawnmower today, you know, with a one bottom plow. And I mean, it took the whole season to plant 50 acres, you know, with the equipment you had back then. So, I mean, everybody was a farmer. I mean, there wasn't a lot of off-farm work.
And number one, they had to sustain their own living.
Yeah.
And if they had enough left over, then they could bring it in.
Yeah. No, they canned and they, you know, did all that stuff that nobody thinks about doing today, you know. They grew a garden, they canned all that stuff, and they ate it all winter long, you know.
As I've already mentioned, the history of Mills and Clyde is inextricably tied to the history of farming in the surrounding area. So in order to understand why the Ketchum mill closed in the 1970s when it did, it is necessary to look at how farming and the needs of farmers changed from the time when the mill opened in the early 1900s to when it closed 60 years later. There are many ways to tell the story of 20th century U.S. agriculture, which often fit into two broad categories. On the one hand, there are triumphalist narratives featuring dazzling technological progress, soaring production, benevolent U.S. economic power abroad, abundant crops, declining global hunger, and lower food prices for American consumers. On the other hand, there are also more critical narratives about power consolidation, inequality, declining small farms, environmental degradation, increasingly inhumane treatment of animals, rising obesity, and increasing economic precarity in rural America. Welcome to the third and final episode of Millstone, a podcast about the history and challenges of a 20th century feed mill in Clyde, New York, USA. I want to start by saying that instead of picking any of these broad narratives and selecting our facts to fit, I think it's best to zoom in on Clyde and first look at the facts of how its agriculture and agricultural industries changed in the 20th century. While the story I'm telling doesn't really fit neatly into a triumphalist or critical frame, it surely has characteristics of both. And as with all historical narratives, the act of choosing certain facts and voices to highlight and then using them to weave together a story is an imperfect act of interpretation, and thus contains an element of bias. In this case, my bias. I say this not to delegitimize my story, but rather to challenge listeners to be active and aware participants in the incomplete and iterative process that is the telling of history. With that said, let's get into it. By and large, farming around Clyde has not been immune to national trends of the last century. While township-level data is not readily available, we can see from agricultural census data of Wayne County, where Clyde sits, that the county generally reflects the national trend of skyrocketing production of a few specific commodity crops on a smaller and smaller number of larger and larger farms. In 2017, there were only 829 farms in Wayne County, compared to 4,882 in 1890. In that same period, farm size nearly tripled from 70.4 acres in 1890 to 192 acres in 2017. Production shot up with over 3.6 million bushels of corn produced in 2017 compared to less than 700,000 in 1890. Soaring production has been made possible through massive improvements in yield. Wayne County corn yields in 1890 were just under 30 bushels per acre. In 2017, that figure more than quintupled to 169 bushels per acre. Increasing productivity has been the defining characteristic of U.S. agriculture over the last 200 years. From the early 1800s to about 1930, productivity gains were largely the result of labor-saving machines, which drove down labor requirements, but did not dramatically increase yields or production per acre of land. However, after 1930, and even more dramatically after the Second World War, yields exploded while labor requirements continued to drop. This precipitous growth in productivity has been the result of a series of overlapping and related causes. One undeniable cause is technology, and we could loosely divide technology into three subcategories I'll call tools, energy, and inputs. In terms of tools, since the early 1800s, all of the processes involved in farming, from tilling and planting to cultivating and cutting to threshing and shelling grain, have been increasingly mechanized, with many of these processes being combined in a series of inventions known commonly and logically as combines. Additionally, as horses displaced other draft animals during this period, productivity rose accordingly. To really grasp how revolutionary these tools were in terms of labor savings, let's consider a couple figures that historian Vaclav Smil compiles in his excellent 2017 book, Energy and Civilization. According to Smil, on a typical New England wheat farm in the year 1800, 162 total hours of human and animal labor were required to successfully farm 1 hectare, 10,000 square meters, or 2.7 acres of land. Again, that's 162 hours. By contrast, 100 years later, in 1900, the most productive wheat farms in the U.S. needed only 9 hours per hectare. Put another way, that's 7.2 minutes of work per kilogram of grain in 1800 compared to about 24 seconds in 1900. Tool improvements continued in the 20th century as tractors gradually displaced animals in pulling and powering farm machines in the fields beginning around 1930. As a small historical tidbit, an early precursor to the tractor was actually produced in Clyde, with the S.W. Wood and Son factory on Ford Street. Wood's machine was a mobile steam engine that could power farming machines and could be moved by horse. Along with tools, the second subgroup of technology I'll call energy. New farming implements like tractors relied on revolutionary changes in energy access, namely fossil fuels. The ability to unearth and then combust concentrated solar energy stored in the lithosphere opened unprecedented horizons for human civilization and human agriculture. And of course, unprecedented risks as well, the fact of climate change being an obvious one. It would be no exaggeration to say that fossil fuels have transformed agriculture in the United States and globally. According to Smil, quote, "Fossil fuels and electricity have become indispensable inputs in modern farming. They are used directly to power machines and indirectly to build them, to extract mineral fertilizers, to synthesize nitrogenous compounds, and a still expanding variety of protective agrochemicals, pesticides, fungicides, herbicides, to develop new crop varieties, and most recently, to energize the electronics used in many functions that now support precision farming. Fossil fuels and electricity have brought higher and more reliable yields. They have displaced virtually all draft animals in all rich countries and greatly reduced their importance in poor ones. And the replacement of muscles by internal combustion engines and electric motors sustained the reduction of labor started by pre-industrial farming advances." End quote. The final technological factor in the explosion of agricultural productivity, as Smil mentions, was an array of new synthetic inputs that conquered previous limitations on agriculture, namely soil fertility, pests, and weeds. In terms of soil fertility, the invention of synthetic nitrogen fixation, or the process of using energy to take nitrogen from the atmosphere and turn it into a solid, usable compound in the early 20th century, unlocked a missing link in chemical fertilizer and opened previously impossible economies of scale through monoculture farming, which are farms growing only 1 or 2 crops. Before that point, planting legumes and clovers was one of the only ways to imbue the soil with nitrogen, which ensured a certain level of crop rotation and diversity. Also contributing to new economies of scale were the use of new synthetic chemicals that acted as herbicides and pesticides, protecting farm yields from weeds and pests. While often superficially effective, these chemicals, the most infamous being DDT, also had unintended consequences for ecosystems and for human health. Do you remember that being a big deal, like which sprays were kosher and which weren't? Was that a controversy at all for you?
Well, later it was, because people got more concerned about, back when I first started, and one of the main thing was the grain, treating grain. When you were cleaning grain, you had a liquid product you put on it that would keep it from molding or rotting in the ground if the ground was wet and so on. And it was a mercury-based product. And it was a red product, and you could always you could smell it and taste it for weeks after you used it. And the red would stay on your hands and everything.
Wow.
And finally, like, if I remember right, it was in Mexico or something, some pigs got into some of that stuff and it killed them all, and all of a sudden everybody was saying, "What are we doing here? We all use this, you know." And I can remember you could taste that stuff in your mouth for a week or two after you did the last batch.
Wow.
So
Yeah. Okay.
Were there other things besides that that you remember?
well, fertilizers changed somewhat, but not too much. It was the chemicals that everybody all of a sudden got worried about, health.
DDT and all
Yeah,
that
yeah,
kind of thing.
right.
Yeah.
And they all worked pretty good for what they were doing, but there was a lot of stuff they were doing that wasn't so good, I guess.
Yeah.
All of these technological developments, as they successfully slashed labor requirements and drove up yields, also required significant amounts of capital to harness. As a result, many small farmers who could not remain commercially viable were forced out of the industry, a trend certainly visible in Wayne County. In 1920, according to the U.S. Agricultural Census, there were 4,980 farms in Wayne County, and average farm size was just under 70 acres per farm. In 1974, by contrast, there were only 1,333 farms, a 73% decline. At the same time, average farm size had more than doubled to 154 acres. In Wayne County, like other places in rural America, the large farmers who remained often focused on several specific commodity crops and now coexisted with a massive agribusiness sector, which absorbed much of the profits of innovation. One recent example of this new dynamic is the introduction of another yield-pumping input, patented seeds. The terms of use of these genetically modified seeds is subject to controversy, as they often criminalize the age-old practice of saving seeds. This was something Jimmy Hughes mentioned to me when I visited his farm near Clyde.
Wow.
And for seeds, do you buy seed or do you save some of your seeds?
No, corn seeds, a hybrid, you have to buy it. We have volunteer corn like from last year that got spilled in the field, and it'll grow, but it really won't produce an ear, or if it does, it's a real small ear. You have to get a hybrid seed that was grown in Iowa or Illinois. And then what they do is they grow a variety. They go out and cut the tassel off before it can fertilize the silks. And then they have kids come through and fertilize it with a different variety. And that makes a hybrid. And then that seed will produce a good ear. I don't understand. I'm not a geneticist, but.
So you can't replant any corn that we.
You could plant your own soybeans, but it's illegal.
Oh.
Because of all the genetics that they've put into it, they've made it illegal for you to, and your soybeans would actually grow just as fine as the ones you buy, but it's illegal to do.
Wow.
Because, Pioneer or all these seed Northrop King, they've paid money to get these genetics into the seed, so then you can't use it again.
Do you think that's fair? Or
No, I don't think that's fair at all. I've argued with the seed guys. I was at a corn congress one time, and the guy's like, I'm talking to the rep from Pioneer, and he's like, well, we're going to get, I was like, seed's too expensive. He's like, well, this year, this variety, we're going to get you an extra 10 bushel, which is going to pay for the increase in the seed. I go, I don't need another 10 bushel. He goes, what do you mean? I go, there's too much corn. The price is terrible. We grow too much. I don't care if it stays at 150 bushel, and just quit charging me so much for the seed. But
seed is like $200 or $300
$300 a bag.
$300 a bag.
2 acres.
Jimmy's point about overproduction describes the double-edged sword of success. Increasing production has been the trajectory of U.S. agriculture for over 200 years. And it has largely been the goal of U.S. agricultural policy for almost as long. With the passage of the Hatch Act in 1887 establishing agricultural experiment stations at land-grant universities in each U.S. state, the U.S. federal government assumed a new mission of funding and disseminating agricultural research across the country. This included Wayne County, which as early as the 1910s received visits from Extension and Farm Bureau agents demonstrating and promoting the latest and greatest in farm technologies and techniques. However, as production grew, the perennial problem, at least for farmers, of overproduction and low food prices became more acute. In a sense, the history of U.S. agricultural policy in the 20th century has been the history of trying to grow production while simultaneously shielding farmers, most often the largest and most productive farmers, from low food prices. Those strategies ranged from production controls in the 1930s to direct subsidies to farmers in the 1970s to subsidized crop insurance in the 2000s. The details of those specific policies are beyond the scope of this podcast, but the effect has been this. A large amount of taxpayer money has gone to pumping commodity crop production, generally driving prices down for consumers while supporting farmers through those low prices. In places like Clyde, the emphasis on growing production and tapping economies of scale has meant that bigger, more capital-intensive farming operations have largely eclipsed the small farms that dominated the countryside 100 years ago. Relative to other commercial farms in the area, Jimmy Hughes told me his 1,800 acres and 50 head of cattle represent a small operation. So between technology and policy, crop yields, particularly those of corn and soybeans, have soared. This ballooning supply has been met by growing demand for these commodities. More demand from abroad, as U.S. economic power has tapped into markets across the globe. More demand from synthetic food industries that use commodities like corn to make certainly versatile, if unhealthy, ingredients like high fructose corn syrup. And more demand for the meat of animals that eat the majority of the corn grown in the U.S. But what has all this meant for Clyde and for the mills that once dotted its streets? In the same way that improving technology changed the landscape of farming, milling also had to change with the times. When my great-great-grandfather joined Burke's milling business, farmers relied on their local mills to grind their own grain, which then could be fed to their own animals.
But that was an era gone by. Once you got later on into the 80s and so on, then the farmers all had their own mixer and grinder. It saved them having to go to the feed mill. They would just back it up to their own bins and throw the stuff in, hook behind a tractor on a power takeoff. And
which is why George Ketchum could let go of the mill, because the farmers had their own grinder.
Yeah.
As the 20th century wore on, farmers got their own mills, and commercial farmers went beyond the scale of personal grinding. The pressure to scale up has also diminished the economic feasibility of commercial farmers with a variety of crops and animals. Instead, they have been pushed to focus on a small number of products and produce them as efficiently as humanly possible, or should I say mechanically possible.
Well, what most of them do now, you bring that up, there's big feed companies, and of course, dairies are a lot bigger than we used to have. Even the Mennonites are 70, 80 cows. That's what seems to be what they have, and then they're cash crops. But there's an outfit down south of Seneca Falls, and I think there's one in Auburn. Big trucks, a whole X number of tons. We'll bring that in. You buy it by the truckload. It lasts X number of days or whatever, and that's the way the most of it is now. Trucks bring this in. They don't grind. Farmers don't grind their own. They're mixing that stuff. It's these big companies that bring in feed ready to feed.
And the farmers who grow the corn, they don't worry about the grinding so much anymore, right? There's
nothing at all. They either most of the corn that is harvested now is shelled and sold right from the combine.
Today, the closest equivalent between the Ketchum operation near Clyde is Pine Creek Farm and Feed in Loch Berlin, just west of town. And Will Martin of Pine Creek was kind enough to show us around his facility. He showed us the various machines to refine and store grain, machines that were reminiscent of those in the Ketchum mill, although significantly more advanced.
So here's some of the pelleted products. Smell them. They smell the alfalfa hay.
Yeah, it smells very grassy.
Yeah,
totally.
So basically what happens is the grain, those buckets scoop up the grain, take it up top, and send it down. And coming down the road, you can probably see it. There's a big distributor up there with all kinds of pipes going out.
Oh, okay.
So we come in and we say, all right, we want to put that into. So we got distillers. We want to put that into bin 12, and I'll see if I can find that. So we go in and we hit that thing 12, and we go like that, and now that thing's up there. So we've been doing a little work on this thing here this morning, changing some drives and that. But this is where the pelleting gets done. This is the die that is pressing out that pellet that you saw down there.
Okay. Yeah.
So it's as simple as
Despite its towering storage containers and impressive machines for grinding, mixing, and pelleting feeds, even this operation does not primarily serve commercial farmers. Those farmers must travel to places like the massive DeLong Company grain elevator in Geneva, 15 miles to the south, to deposit their grain where it enters the bloodstream of America's industrial food system to be transported and then processed into products like animal feed, ethanol, and corn syrup. Will told us the majority of his customers are hobby or part-time farmers. He recalled hearing about a time past when every little town in the area needed and supported a feed mill.
Well, I hear this so much. Well, every little town had a feed mill. Clyde had a feed mill, and it was before my time. I didn't never, Newark, where the Country Max is, that used to be a little feed mill. Yeah. Every one of those towns, you go out 31, there's a little town, and they had a feed mill. And I understand back in the day, and I hear George Barnes, talking about, when he first worked for Bill Smart, he'd come Monday morning and the trucks are lined up down the road waiting to get their feed ground and bagged back out to take to feed their livestock. Oh, wow. And I think that's what supported all those little feed mills. That's why every town needed a feed mill, because every farmer. But now, you could go to a lot of these farms and ask them, well, do you get feed ground in the feed mill? And they'd say, well, no. If they have livestock, they probably have their own portable grinder that they put behind their tractor and grind their own feed. And they may just come in here and buy a bag of minerals or a couple bags of protein mix or something to put with it.
So the days of the local personal feed grinder like Ketchum and Malloy have passed. Today, Will's business still fills a community need, but it's a distinctly different one than the small commercial mills of the 19th and early 20th centuries. According to my uncle Jim Ketchum, by the time his father George closed his mill, it had become an institution of a bygone era.
And what have you. Now, farina was Dad's top product, no doubt about it, but he also depended on you bring in the elements for the grist, and he will grind it for you and bag it for you and even deliver it back to you as such. But those days were fewer and far between, and the number of local farms that depended upon their product being produced from their own grains and what have you, that was becoming a time of the past.
Throughout this project, when I talked about Clyde with members of my family or other longtime residents of the town, all of them said it had changed. Some said the stores were different, others said the public spaces were different, and others said the people were different.
And of course, the retail has shrunk. I say probably because of Walmart, your big stores don't leave, and they can sell something very often just a little bit less or more. Less. You know what I'm trying to say. A little less or a lot less. Thank you. Than a local store could. So that obviously changes the look of downtown.
Well, I think it boils down.
I'd like to see it all restored. I'd love to see all those buildings nice downtown, and the park back to the way it's supposed to be, the way it used to look. And, it doesn't even look like my park.
What did it used to look like?
Oh my gosh, there were shrubs all around the whole, on the perimeter of the whole park there were shrubs, except for the 4 entrances. Now they got rid of one of the entrances, somebody's bright idea, the one by the post office. They don't have that anymore. They put a curb there and grass. Okay, so why? I don't know. But it used to have the perimeter, they had the 4 entrances, always little gravel. In fact, I think I still have gravel in my knee from falling in it. And we had the nice bandstand, lots of trees, and George Washington, and the fish pond. And the fish pond was really nice. Back in the day, they had fish in it. I had those big orange, koi fish or whatever. And park benches, and right at the end by East Genesee Street, there were here's the park. There were 2 park benches that kind of faced each other like that, and we'd go get like a creamsicle or something from one of the stores downtown. Then we sit on those benches and just talk. The park was great.
I think I think the ethnicity, the Italian heritage, is what really made Clyde different.
Okay.
And I think when all the people started leaving and nobody, people just didn't stay, they left Clyde. That was the end.
Sometimes these conversations had an element of nostalgia for how things used to be.
I just picture Clyde like it used to be, with all the people and the Saturday night. That was a long, long time ago, of course. But. Yeah.
Other times, folks didn't want to label the changes as either progress or regression.
And people will say that means we've gone backward. I would contest that. We look different, but that doesn't mean we have gone backward as a community. It's just that we need to show community in maybe some different ways. And another way in which this has changed is that we've lost the Rotary Club. We don't have a Chamber of Commerce. We still have the Lions Club. 100 years ago, there was the Odd Fellows, the Masons, and Eastern Star and Rebecca's, which were the female portions of those 2 fraternal organizations. The Grange is not meeting like it used to. And so my question is, how can we get together?
No matter how we choose to view the changes in Clyde over the last 100 years, it's undeniable that the transformations in agriculture and its adjacent industries have played a key role. It's also clear that there have been real trade-offs. On the one hand, the residents of Clyde undoubtedly have more access to varied and cheap food than their grandparents did. They, like other Americans, spend a substantially smaller chunk of their income on food, and for that, they have to thank the economies of scale that can produce food so efficiently. On the other hand, that efficiency has seemingly drained places like Clyde of many of the businesses and people that they once had, with many of the profits of agricultural productivity not remaining in farming communities, but instead going to national and in some cases transnational corporate agribusiness entities. It's important to take stock of these trade-offs and consider the possible futures our present trajectory may bring about. The story of the Ketchum Mill is not noteworthy because it is somehow exceptional. On the contrary, it's noteworthy because it isn't. Millstone has been a production of the Galen Historical Society. Thank you to everyone who spoke with Hugh Miner and me as a part of this project, and thank you to all of those who financially supported me and the Galen Historical Society to make this project possible.